Okay, so we are live, so to speak.
Mhm.
Hello, folks. Welcome. If you are watching this, then that means you have an interest in monarch butterflies and specifically in the science around them. My name is Andy Davis, and I'm sitting here in my messy office at the University of Georgia. I'm a longtime researcher of monarchs, and I'm also the author of the Monarch Science blog, which is a place where everyday people can check out the latest research on monarchs. Normally, this blog contains written summaries of the latest studies, but today I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to be chatting directly with a scientist who has recently published a new study that we all need to hear about, and I'm going to then upload this video chat directly to my blog. So should be fun. With me here is Matt Forister, a professor in the Department of Biology at the University of Nevada. Matt's lab is a leader in the analyses of long-term data sets on insect populations, and I've always been a big fan. So welcome, Matt. How are you?
Good. Thanks, Andy. That's nice of you to say.
Yeah. So you've got a new study, a lot of new studies, but I'm thinking that we could chat maybe about the new study in Science, which is awesome. By the way, congrats on getting that paper published there.
Thanks.
I read through it. You know, to be fair, some of the analyses are over my head because you're the expert in the room on this. But I wonder if you could maybe tell us a little bit about the study, and then maybe the upshot, and then we can sort of dive into some of the details if you want.
Sure. Yeah. So this stems out of work that you and I have talked about before from long-term sites that have been monitored in Northern California since the 70s. So I did my PhD with Dr. Art Shapiro at UC Davis, and he started visiting these sites every 2 weeks during the butterfly flight season. So he's done that for almost 50 years now at 10 sites across Northern California.
He's still going, right?
Still going, yeah. So we've taken over monitoring of the mountain sites, and Art continues to go in the valley. So we're proud to keep that going because it is a pretty amazing record. So I've been working with that data for a good 20 years now, and we had learned that there were severe declines in the low elevations near cities and agriculture, and then the West had the mega drought years from 2011 to 2015, roughly. And after that, we saw huge declines in the mountains. And then we sort of looked back at the historical record, and we could see that there were some negative associations with warming and drying conditions in the mountains, which seemed to be rivaling some of the declines that we'd only seen at low elevations before. So that raised this huge question of whether or not butterflies in the West in general, in areas removed from agriculture and urban lands, would be declining.
So just to back up then, so the impetus behind this new work was the research findings from the Shapiro data.
Yeah, I was really wanting to know if we could extend those spatially out to the whole West.
Okay, and then you looked at all butterflies.
Yeah, and so then we brought in these two different data sets. The core of the paper was the NABA data, so that's a North American Butterfly Association. So they organized these summer counts.
Do you want to show a screenshot, or do you want me to?
Yeah, I can. Let me just arrange this so I can look at figures from the paper. Okay, yeah. So I can share here. I think that will work. Can you see that?
Yep, looks good.
So the top panel there, those are the 10 sites that we've been working with in Northern California going back to the 70s. Then here in the middle, these are the North American Butterfly Association summer counts. So they're like the equivalent of the Christmas bird counts, which people may know about.
Yeah.
At least once during the summer, butterfly enthusiasts go out to the same spot every year, and they count all the butterflies they can find in a certain area. That's been going on for decades in some of these places. This shows all sites. A subset of these, 72 of them, had at least 10 years of data. So we use those to ask about trajectories for all of the other butterflies living in the West. And then the bottom here is iNaturalist records, which we also used in kind of a different way than these records are often used. The great strength of iNaturalist is documenting where things live. It's not really designed to ask about when things live. But we took some recent years that we thought were well sampled enough, and we asked about the frequency of observation of individual species in the iNaturalist records.
So how far back did the INAC data go?
So that I truncated at 2005, which is basically the origin of the iPhone.
Pretty much.
So
Okay.
yeah, and so the iNaturalist data is interesting because it's part of the GBIF data set, Global Biodiversity Inventory something. I just forgot what the S stands for.
Yeah.
That's a big sort of clearinghouse for various types of publicly available data, and iNaturalist is part of that. And there's a bunch of papers coming out where people are using a lot of that data going pretty far back. When you go too far back, the data gets really complicated because it's built more on museum records farther back.
Okay.
So we truncated 2005 where it's people using their iPhones, so it's fairly standardized.
There just must be just so much data though since then.
Oh yeah, it's crazy. And it's challenging data to work with because it's exponentially increasing the use.
Yeah, I bet.
Right. But really the heart of our paper was this NABA data, which is pretty wonderful way to ask about patterns across the West.
And this is patterns of all species, all butterfly species.
Yep. And so there were more than 200 species that were well represented across these sites for at least 10 years of data. And so we use that to ask about change over time in those species. Are they being seen with more or less frequency? And this histogram is telling that up here. The dark bars are species that are being seen with less frequency than they used to in the past. And it is a majority of species. There are species doing better than they used to be, but a majority of species are doing worse. So that broadly agreed with the Shapiro data set. I can switch to another figure here where we then developed population models for individual species. And this is and they can be ranked in different ways and it gets kind of complicated, but by one ranking, here's top 50 species that are not doing well. And the values being plotted here. So for example, take Vanessa annabella, which I think is an interesting one to think about in the West. So that's the West Coast lady. And a big animal, big nymphalid, robust looking thing. It eats some weeds that live in sidewalk cracks, not something you would expect to be suffering. So the dark dot there is the species level estimate for population growth rate for that species. And these are scaled to be around 1. So 1, if anybody's taken sort of undergrad ecology, 1 is lambda, right? So that's stability. Left of 1 is not. And if you look then at Annabella, all of the gray diamonds are population level estimates or location level estimates. And they're amazingly clustered to the left of 1. So it is just a species experiencing amazingly homogeneous decline.
So just to boil this down to the viewers here, if you're for each species, then you want to be to the right of the dotted line down the center.
Yep.
And that means your population is growing. If you're to the left, that means your population is declining.
Yep. And you can see the monarch is down here. And the monarch, of course, is complicated, as I'm sure if people follow your work know, because this is based on summer counts way out across the whole West for the most part, right? So it doesn't reflect overwintering numbers. The monarch is in the top decliners, but it's not the worst by this measure.
How much is by this measure for the monarch is it declining from this estimate here?
So the lambda is a little bit to the left of 1 species level. It was like maybe 0.97, 0.98, something like that.
I mean, can you boil that down to our everyday number, like in percentages per year, or what does that mean?
So that's like a decline of, let's say 1.5% per year or something like that.
Okay.
And overall, I had to, maybe the monarch is closer to 1.25. I actually don't remember. I should have got the monarch number for you. Sorry. Across all species where we had our sort of most robust estimate, when we look across these sites and we just count up the total number of butterflies that people observed, which is nice here because then it's not muddied with identification, right? So just how many individual butterflies did people see? We estimated about 1.6% fewer individuals per year. So that's a compounding change, and I can give you a concrete number on that. So if you imagine going to a nice meadow on a western mountain 20 years ago in the middle of July and you saw 1,000 individual butterflies, which wouldn't be that hard to do walking around for 4 or 5 hours. If you go back to that same meadow today, 20 years later, our estimate is you'd see about 725 individual butterflies. So that's a pretty remarkable loss. That's that compounding of 1.6% per
This
year.
kind of agree with Art's recollections.
Yeah, it agrees with, yes. So it agrees with a couple of different lines of evidence. It does agree with data from art sites. You know, it broadly agrees with the so-called windshield effect. There's just fewer individual things hitting people's butterflies. When I talk to the press about this paper, the anecdote I give for the windshield effect is that I've been driving back and forth on the I-80 corridor to visit my parents for a long time. They live in the Central Valley. And 15, 20 years ago, it used to be the case that when I'd show up at home, my dad would get out the hose and wash the car windshield, and we just don't do that
You know,
anymore.
I keep hearing about this windshield effect all the time. I wish we had taken a bucket and put all those washed off, you know, bugs into a bucket and weighed them back then, because we all keep saying the same thing, but we know we don't have data on it.
So there is one study that's fairly recent that you should look up. I think I should have found. I think it was from the Netherlands. It's somewhere in Northern Europe where they actually got data, I believe, from pictures or something from
Wow,
windshield. Then they quantified it. It's pretty cool.
wow, that's cool.
So
So
that's
then,
yeah. Go ahead.
okay, so so yeah, so the gist is that, you know, this paper is showing that a lot of species, a lot of butterflies are in the West are declining. Can you get at the reason why with your data here?
Yeah, so we modeled a number of factors that are potentially associated with decline. So those factors included the fraction of surrounding land that was agricultural, urban, characterizations of climate, both sort of average climate and then change through time. So how much places had been warming or drying out. And the surprise was that we found that those indices of climate change were the most powerful here. So places that have been warming in particular are seeing fewer butterflies over time.
So it's sort of, I mean, I think that's a really cool finding, especially, and it sounds pretty powerful considering that it's based on so many different species, right?
Yeah, and the important thing to note here, and I'm glad to be able to say this because we tried to be clear about this in the paper, but it's tricky, is this isn't saying that habitat loss and pesticides are not important, because these places that we studied were places that were chosen by butterfly enthusiasts to be nice places to look for butterflies, right? So these are not places, for the most part, that are very close to agriculture and urban areas.
That seems like the Achilles heel of these data, right? Is that,
Or is it the Achilles heel of all other data? Because one could make the argument that most other long-term data sets have focused on locations that were highly impacted by humans. So here we have the opportunity to learn something about climate because we have locations that are relatively open natural spaces. So it's a chance to learn about climate is the way that I'm thinking about it. It doesn't say that those other things are not important.
you know, congrats again on this paper. Can we focus a little bit? Can we drill down a bit on the monarchs, because everyone comes to my blog, you know, to hear about the monarch research. This paper wasn't necessarily about monarchs, but it definitely has a monarch story. I mean, what's going on in the West right now with monarchs? I mean, the Western population appears to have been the crash. They crashed this past year.
Yeah. So
What can you tell us about that?
the last few years have been the most miserable anyone can remember. I think I saw one adult butterfly and no caterpillars the entire season last year, the entire calendar year, which is certainly a first. And I'm in the field a lot in the summer. So one individual, and ironically, it flew through my backyard in Reno. So you know, why the monarch? Lots of multifaceted things affect any one insect. So the way I like to think about it is, at the level of all butterflies, I think we're quite confident that we know what the problems are. It's habitat loss, it's habitat degradation, it's climate change. But then when you go into any one species, that's where things get really complicated. And I think the monarch, along with some of these other widespread species, are particularly complicated because they're sampling all of these problems because they cover so much space.
Well, how do you
Right?
mean? What do you
So
mean?
it's different. So think about a narrow endemic, something that only lives in, you know, alpine meadows For a species like that, we could really narrow it in and just say it's got to be climate change because those mountain meadows aren't impacted by anything else. It's not being hit by pesticides, etc. But for something like the monarch, that where individuals literally move from some of the most pristine places in our country through some of the most heavily polluted places in our country, and they're all warming at the same time.
So the fact that they utilize such a broad diversity of habitats and landscapes, it means it's hard to pin down what landscape is missing or been altered by them. And because maybe they have, you know, such an array of different life stages throughout
Yep.
the annual cycle, right?
And I think there's an irony here for traditional conservation, in that we used to think that things with broad geographic ranges were going to be the most robust. Even if we forget about migration for a minute and think about things like that West Coast lady, Vanessa Annabella, that has a huge geographic range, probably a pretty serious metapopulation structure, right? Like lots of dispersal among local locations. Traditional conservation biology should say that that's the last thing we worry about. But what if that kind of metapopulation structure is sampling all of the problems and it's causing, dispersal to fall apart across that metapopulation? What if that's worse than being a narrow endemic in a few meadows in the Sierra Nevada? I don't know. I'm speculating, right?
Well, it's ironic, we have so much data on the monarch, right?
Sure.
Most other species would kill to have this much data on their, or we would kill to have this much data on those species, right? But we've got so much data on every conceivable life stage of the monarch, but yet it's such a complexity, it's such a complicated story, and we still can't figure it out.
The other thing that frustrates me with the monarch, or is a challenge for the monarch, and as you know, I don't really think of myself as a monarch biologist. I think about all these other butterflies. For these other butterflies, we have population replication, and so we can look at populations that are closer to agriculture and populations that are farther from agriculture. For monarchs, it's basically one population that expands and condenses, talking about the West. That lack of replication is pretty challenging. It would be totally different if there were monarchs of Southern California and Oregon and monarchs of Washington. They had independent dynamics. I think we would be able to learn more. But the one thing that this might sort of contribute to the monarch story is that warming in the fall was the most negative climate change factor that we saw across the West for butterflies.
Well,
and so it's possible that warming in the fall going into winter, as you know, could be interfering with overwintering stages of monarchs. So there may be some coming together there.
Or it's interfering with their natural cues to prepare for migration.
Yep.
Right. Yep. And that's sort of what's going on in the East right now, is that the warming falls are causing either a late fall migration start, or the monarchs are simply, producing one extra generation.
Yep.
In the fall that emerges later. So either way, they're starting later, and then they run into more challenges along the way to get to their sites in Mexico.
Another possibility that maybe is more pedestrian is that warming at the end of summer into fall is a really sensitive time for nectar resources. And I suspect that's part of the impact on all the other butterflies, especially in the arid West, right? Where by the time you get to the start of fall, it's like the whole ecosystem is holding its breath, waiting for winter rains, right? Because we have the hot and dry summers. So it's like we're prolonging that holding of the breath at the end of summer into fall. And it just could be there's just a few less nectar resources, which would also impact monarchs as they head back to the coast.
So can I pick your brain then, getting still on the monarch then? Recently the monarch was considered for the endangered species list in the US. And the Fish and Wildlife Service decided that they warranted listing, but didn't list them as of this time. Mm-hmm. What do you think about that decision?
Guess I'd have to say any resources towards this or any other declining butterfly would have been better than not. Which maybe I'm sort of dodging the question there. But from a pragmatic perspective, I do think the monarch is in trouble in the West more than in the East, I think.
That's the general consensus, I think.
Yeah, and I would have liked to have seen more resources dedicated to it. Now the caveat to that is I don't know exactly how those resources should have been spent, because milkweeds don't look terribly limiting to me in the West. It's not to say they're not limiting under some circumstances, and maybe nectar's limiting in the fall. But in general, I would have been happy to have more resources going towards this or any butterfly.
I've always wondered if maybe the Fish and Wildlife was sort of between a rock and a hard place with this, because there's so much public outcry for the monarch, and so if they didn't list them, they would have gotten yelled at. But maybe this was sort of a happy medium, because even if they do list them, say they listed them tomorrow, what then becomes of those milkweed habitats? They would be federally protected, right?
Yeah.
You can't chop them down. You can't, and think of all the roadsides with milkweeds and state agencies that mow those milkweeds. I mean, it would have been a legal quagmire, really.
Yep, I hear you, and I'm not an expert in that stuff, but I could appreciate the complexity of that for sure.
Yeah. So let me ask you then, what do you think is the next step in this line of research with investigating long-term trends in monarchs or other species, maybe in the West or in the East?
Yep. So a couple of things. I would like to have sort of a new generation of going out and figuring out where these butterflies are. Because our best data across the whole West now is this midsummer snapshot. So we can't very well deal with sort of phenological shifts, things emerging earlier in the spring, for example, and that may be complicating this pattern. It's also the case that for some of these species that are becoming really rare, maybe they're shifting their geographic ranges and they're in habitats where we're not used to looking for them. I don't really think that's terribly likely, but we need to do more looking across the landscape, more points in time, more different kinds of habitats in the West. So that's one thing. And sorry, go ahead.
Well, what you just said there sort of reminded me that, you're probably aware of the recent research by Bill Snyder's lab and Mike Crosley, where they looked at NABA data as well. And their paper just came out in Global Change. Yeah. You probably reviewed that one. But their research, and actually Bill just got here to UGA. He came from the Pacific Northwest, and he's now a professor here. But their research just came out, and it shows that the NABA data that they looked at the Western and Eastern, and all over the U.S. They found that some places of the U.S. showed increases in abundance, and some showed decreases.
Yep.
Overall, there was not really any sort of net change across the entire gamut.
So my understanding, I actually just read that last night because it just came out. There is a slight net change trending toward the negative. But you're right, for sure, their message is heterogeneity and that the West is doing the worst. So their findings are consistent with ours for the West. I think the West is warming and drying at a rate that the rest of the country is not. We know that that's the case. And the other parts of the country are being impacted by climate change in different ways, increased severity and frequency of storms, et cetera. It may be that those things are not as bad as warming as drying for these arid ecosystems out here.
Climate change is becoming the new boogeyman for the monarch and for a lot of other species. And it seems like this is a tough one, right? If the prior boogeyman was, milkweed decline, it seems like an easy fix. We should all just plant milkweed. But if the new reason for the declines now is just that the earth is getting warmer, what are we going to do here?
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there's a way, like with corals, like ocean corals, scientists are now trying to figure out how to propagate species that are more resistant to warming temperatures, so that we can sort of buffer ourselves against this decline, this increase in temperature. I wonder if we could do something similar with butterflies.
Don't know. What I have said to folks who raise this issue, that has it just all become even more hopeless now that climate change, especially in the West? I think the answer is, though, that it's an important lesson, at least for us in the West here, where we have so much open land and protected land, that it's really a temptation. Previously, it's been a temptation to think that that's enough, that as long as we have protected land out there, that's fine. We don't need to worry so much about choices with respect to pesticides or planting natives, et cetera. So I think it raises the stakes for decisions we make about land that we can actually impact. right?
Do people ask you, what should I do as a homeowner?
Yeah, and standing, in fact, just yesterday I went and talked to a bee group standing in Reno. It's interesting to talk to people and say it matters what pesticides you spray in your yard, because we have butterflies in Reno. We have nice butterflies in Reno. We have these canyons that sort of cut through town. They're around, but you can see folks' eyes sort of wandering up to the mountains that we can see all around us. And I just know there's this feeling like, yeah, but I don't want aphids on my roses, and there's all those mountains out there. Why do I need to worry about it? Well, I think the message of our paper is that it is worth worrying about, right? Because things are suffering out there. We should address climate change, but that's a big problem. But the individual homeowner, it still does matter what they do in their yards. That's all I can offer. I don't know about bioengineering butterflies for climate change.
One last question. What's next for you? What's your lab up to right now?
So this work does raise some experimental questions that are pretty fascinating. This issue of warming conditions in the fall interfering with overwintering states. We're planning to get into that, which we can do with lots of species that are fairly tractable in the lab, right? And that overwinter locally at our mountain sites. So we're going to be doing some sort of classic growth chamber type experiments there.
You mean when they overwinter as pupae or something like that?
Or so there's various overwintering stages, which then is an interesting experimental question, because there's species that overwinter as eggs and adults and pupae, right? And so is warming conditions in the fall interfering with those different stages?
Okay.
So that's interesting. I'm also really keen to understand pesticides more, accumulation of pesticides in, near to urban and rural areas, I think is pretty important to figure out. And also I'd like to learn about other insects in the West. So we've got a project starting now and a postdoc who's a specialist on scrubbing sort of historical records from the gray literature and sort of,
Wow.
federal agencies and whatnot. So we need to learn about other insects too.
I'm not hearing anything about monarchs. Is that, are you scared away from the monarchs?
No, I never really have been a monarch biologist. I would think that there's enough smart people thinking about monarchs that I'm just not a
Well,
monarch.
I'm always a fan of people like yourselves, though, who are more objective about the data and who can sort of just look at the numbers and look at the trends and report what they see. It's almost better to have somebody like you who to look at the data as well.
Right, we can't all be monarch biologists, then, right? Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, then, this has been awesome, Matt. Thank you for joining me and for sharing your thoughts on this topic. I'm going to upload this video to my blog, and you're welcome to share it and with your friends, and hopefully I'll have you on again soon.
Sure. Great.
Good luck with your lab stuff, and I'll look forward to seeing your latest papers in Science and Nature.
Nice to talk to you.
Awesome.